This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the Carlos Museum and the Creativity Conversation Series. My name is Leslie Taylor, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Creativity and Arts. I'm here to give you a very brief introduction to our two conversationalists. Dr. Rosemary Magee is the Vice President and Secretary of Emory University and the head of the University Creativity and Arts Initiative. In 2008, she received the Thomas Jefferson Award for significant service through personal activities, influence, and leadership. Prior to 2004, she was a senior associative dean in Emory College. Rosemary has been one of Emory's most compelling voices for the arts and creativity on campus. The very existence of the Schwartz Center is due in no small part to her tireless determination and diplomacy. An advocate for the arts, service, and civility, I am glad to have her as a friend and a colleague. Philip Glass, to the left of Rosemary, is a composer of many parts. He has composed operas, film scores, for the theater, for dance, for music ensembles, solo works, and symphonies. He has worked with a wide range of artists, including Robert Wilson, Twyla Tharp, Woody Allen, David Bowie, and Martin Scorsese. If you were as fortunate as I, you might have been able to hear and see the Atlanta Opera's production of Akhnaten in the Schwartz Center this past weekend. It was a beautiful performance, and I have been really fortunate in seeing several other productions that included Philip Glass music, including Einstein at the Beach and The Fall of the House of Usher and a number of other ones, and it's wonderful. If you did not get to see Akhnaten this weekend, you have another opportunity to hear his music this evening. They will be screening the Martin Scorsese film Kundun, which Philip Glass was the composer for, and he will also be introducing it at 6:30 in Whitehall 208. Did I get that right? 6:30? Yeah. Last night, during the pre-opera conversation with Shalom Goldman, Philip Glass received the President's Medal from President James Wagner, honoring his contribution to the art. So I would look forward to having these two award winners talk to each other about creativity and arts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie, for that really lovely introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here, and a special thanks to Philip Glass for not only coming to campus, but really being a part of our campus. In fact, yesterday, when you were awarded the President's Medal, you said something like, Emory is one of the homes that you like to inhabit. And we're happy that you consider us to be one of your homes, and happy to have you back here. The question that I really wanted to start out with, we're going to be primarily talking about the collaborative process and the creative process today. But the question that I wanted to start with really has to do with what it feels like to you to hear your music in new settings and new places that you haven't heard it before, or you haven't thought about it in a while, and what ends up surprising you about your music?
Well, in the case of Akhnaten, this was, it's been 25 years, almost exactly, since it was premiered. So in the first place, there's that distance of time. And hearing pieces that I wrote at that time, so that would be, it was 45, I was in my late 40s when I wrote that. So I wasn't a beginning composer by any means. I began writing when I was 15. I've been writing for a long time. But the language of music changes for everybody, and my own language has changed too. So what I heard last night, I was very pleased with. First of all, it was a beautiful performance. So it was very accomplished from the musical point of view, and theatrically, it was beautifully accomplished, I felt. When I am in a situation like that, I'm hearing a piece I haven't heard for a while.
Right.
I'm always worried that it's not going to see, I could have done that better, or why did I have those kinds of course, I'm not performing.
Right.
I can just sit down, I can even crawl out, and I want to hide someplace. And with these, there's a certain period that I reached in the mid-70s, and from that time on, when I go back to those pieces, I don't feel uncomfortable about them. I think, that sounds good. I'm a little surprised because I think, I remember that particular score. If you, in those days it was before we had computerized images and so forth, and copying was done by hand. That was probably 800 pages of music.
Wow.
And it's just a lot of notes, you know. And so you would say, well, it's a couple hours of music, maybe a little bit more. And actually, I kind of admired that young man who had the patience to sit down and write all that music. But it seems that distant in that way, Rosemary. I feel, who was the person that did that? Now, that puts me in a very unique position because I both remember it and I don't remember it.
Uh-huh.
I don't remember writing it, and that's puzzling. This is not, we're talking about memory. I don't know if you really wanted to talk about this.
Memory's good, yeah.
This is an
I'm happy to talk
interesting
about memory,
subject.
right.
And one thing that very often, even now, when I'm doing a piece, and someone will say, look, is this note an E or an E flat? And I'll say, oh, look at this. I don't remember. I don't remember which one I wrote. And then I was just rehearsing with the Kronos Quartet. We were doing Dracula live up in, and this will happen. Now, we played this piece 10 years. And there's still mistakes in the music. This music is like that. And someone said, I'm not sure it's this way or that way. And I said, what do you think? And I said, well, if anyone finds the composer around here, why don't you ask him? Maybe he'll remember. But now there's a reason we don't remember. And I was puzzled about this. I can remember a lot of things, but a lot of the details kind of escape us. And I believe that what happens is that the act of writing almost bars us from the ability to remember it. Let's put it this way: the amount of attention that's required to keep the stuff going,
Right.
It's an unusual amount of attention. And in order to find that attention, we grab every bit of our awareness that we can.
Yeah, storage
And
in the
that
hard disk.
includes the part of us that watches us while we're doing things, which we all have. We watch ourselves. I'm watching myself. It's a common thing. But in that moment when you're alone and you're working, there is no, and you need that little extra attention. You steal it from yourself.
Right. You're then in the moment.
So you're doing it. So very basically, the person that watches is not there. And the person that's remembering and storing that memory isn't functioning because you're writing music.
But then when you hear it again, does it come back to you
Sometimes
in a
it
new
sounds,
way?
it sounds good to me or not good to me, but I don't remember writing it. And it's not because I'm in early or late stages of some degenerative mental disease, but just because I probably, at the time I was writing it, I wasn't thinking about remembering it.
A different state of consciousness.
It's a different, I think the amount of attention that you need to do certain kinds of work, and I think that would be true of almost anyone. Maybe someone who does a complicated cuisine of some, how did you do that? Well, they might not remember all the stages of it because we're too busy working. I think we're often too busy doing the things that are very compelling to us, and so that we've lost that side of it. So the experience for me of hearing music, first of all, I don't listen to a lot of the things I've done because I'm usually doing something else. There have been 6 or 7 productions of Akhnaten. I've only seen 3. I've seen 4. This is the 4th one. I saw one in Germany. I saw one that was done in New York, and I saw one that was done by Mary Zimmerman in Boston, Chicago. But there are 3 that I didn't see, and there may be more that I didn't see because I don't always know where they're being done. I don't keep up with it. So that when I hear it, I'm probably hearing something I haven't heard in 6 or 7 years.
Well, speaking of watching yourself, you said something yesterday in a conversation with Shalom Goldman about you've done many operas, but you've also done these 3 that are part of a trilogy: Akhnaten, Gandhi, Einstein. Those 3 very famous people. And something you said yesterday was that, well, of course, what the composer writes is not necessarily about the figure, but about himself. And so what do you think that these operas, either taken separately or independently or together, say about you?
Well, it has to do with it has to do with what formed my own personality. I grew up in the city of Baltimore, in the, even the way I say it, you can tell it was quite a while ago. We don't even call it that in Baltimore. Baldimere. That's
I wondered how you spelled it.
yeah, that's how you spell it. So anyway, I grew up there in the 50s, and actually by 56 I was going to college. I went very young. But it was a city, you might not think of it that way, but Baltimore we considered a southern town. It was in the midst of all the, it was a segregated society. It was in a lot of ways, which we don't even remember anymore. A lot of America has changed a lot, but I grew up in the midst of two things: the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. Those two things.
Right.
And I also, many of the things that I encountered during that time, certain movies that I saw, I remember now. For example, I later did a whole series of operas based on Cocteau films. Well, I saw those movies in the 50s. So it seems that impressions that were made on me at that time became lifelong material that I work with.
Very formative years for you.
So when I began working in opera, one of the things I noticed about theater, which was very interesting, is that it's a place where social issues can come into the work. And people have often said, well, what does art have to do with life? How does your music connect to the world you live in? And if you write symphonies and string quartets, you might have a tough time convincing people that it makes any difference whether you write a symphony or not. I don't think they happen to like symphonies. But when we start dealing with material that has the possibility of telling a story or recounting an event, then the possibility of being engaged with the world in a quasi-social political way becomes possible. And the other thing I have to tell you, which you may not know, is that artists are very often worried about this. They say, okay, I do paintings, I do poetry, but does it matter? Does anybody care? What am I contributing to the world I live in? Or am I just gazing at my navel and, is it just something for my own recreation and absorption? But, and I began writing theater music when I was 20, and I found out right away that was a place where you can talk about the life we live, apart from being a musician, apart from being a painter.
In the theater.
In the theater, you can do that. So those three operas were about social change.
Right.
That was the big topic that social change included both the civil rights issues and the anti-war movements and all it was a very juicy package of things to get worried about. And my generation, we worried about that a lot. I think that's your generation too, to a degree.
I'll claim
and
that
maybe
as
many
well.
people here might remember that. It's a little bit different now. I don't mean that it's worse, but there was a lot more marching in the streets than we do these days.
Well, we're experiencing some seismic shifts in our culture, economic shifts, political shifts, global warming shifts, climate shifts, and I'm wondering if you think that those shifts that we're experiencing now in our culture will have an impact on your work, or have had an impact on your current
I think
work.
they will in a slightly different way. I think the better times so we're talking about creativity,
Right.
the periods where the artists seem to be on fire with ideas. And in retrospect, we look at those times and say that this was a great time for poetry.
Right.
We're going to be listening to some Allen Ginsberg later today. His great years were in the 50s and 60s. What was distinctive about the time? It was economically not a good time.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't much money. We didn't think we were in a recession. We just didn't have any money. We didn't, and so everybody, that. So what I'm wondering is slightly different. I'm wondering whether, with this so-called whatever this is, contraction, recession, whatever you want to call it, I think that for younger people, there's going to be working in the arts is going to be more difficult. It's going to be more like it was when I was a kid. It may be we've drifted in some way artists have become part of the entertainment world more than we know. And I've done that too. And I haven't, I've enjoyed it actually. I've done movies, I've done ballets, I've done operas, and I've done string quartets too. I've done all kinds of things, and I've liked all of that. But there may not be the finances to put on big things anymore. So then I think the younger generations are going to start reinventing things. I think that's, so I'm looking at it that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's interesting is not that the issues are new, because they aren't. We were worrying about the environment. Godfrey Reggie and I were making movies in 1979. Queen of Scotsy, this movie's about technology and the impact. I mean, people have been worrying about that stuff for years. That's not so new, but what may be new is that the problems may seem more urgent for several reasons. For one thing, that the problems are worse, but I think also that we don't have, we're not in an economic cocoon where we can not worry about, we don't have to worry about things.
Well, speaking of some of the artists that you've just mentioned and some of the projects that you've been involved in, I want to talk a little bit about the whole process of collaboration. We had many of us had the opportunity to observe and participate in the Atlanta Opera production. You and Shalom Goldman and the Atlanta Opera Company and many other people were collaborators in that, both in its inception and in the actual production. I pointed out to you earlier the sculpture of Saul LeWitt that's here on our campus, and you've collaborated with Saul LeWitt. You mentioned Allen Ginsberg. Other very famous collaborators, Twyla Tharp, filmmakers, et cetera, et cetera. So the list goes on. And I think, since that's been such an important part of your life and your work and how we've come to know your work, I'd like to talk a little bit about that process of collaboration. Does the process differ, let's say, when you're dealing with a visual artist on the one hand, or a choreographer on the other, in terms of how it begins and how it moves forward?
The forms itself can dictate certain procedures. Though effectively, I think the best situation is when we all start together at the same time. That doesn't actually happen as much as you might think.
Right.
For example, with an opera like Akhnaten, before I could write the music, I needed to have a text. So Shalom Goldman and I spent years working on that part of it. There wasn't any designer around, there wasn't any director around yet. I think we knew where we were going to perform it. But so there can be I've tried to arrange things in such a way that the collaborators start together. It's not so easy to do, but you can do it with film sometimes, and you can do it with opera. I'm working on an opera now about the astronomer Kepler, and I had two German writers that were working on it, a Belgian designer director, an American music director, and myself. And we began having meetings before, and I hadn't written a note, and I didn't have a word written yet. Now, the trouble with that is that sometimes, in fact, sometimes someone gets behind, and then you have to it happened with Kepler, but it also happened with Akhnaten, that Shalom Goldman reminded me that I was anxious to start, and he didn't have the first pages quite ready yet. Shalom, are you here today? I don't know if it's here. But yeah, he is, okay. And he reminded me that I wrote the prologue to the opera because I was so anxious to get started, I couldn't wait for the words, so I wrote a whole piece of music.
So we have him to thank for that.
I have him to thank for that. Yeah. So I think that Akhnaten was. We were working together, but the other elements. So we didn't have the director right away, and so it doesn't always work that way. But ideally, you put everyone in the room and you start talking about it. And my feeling about it is that the collaboration has more to do with the personalities of the people than with the form that we're working in. The personalities of the people will inflect on the whole process much more deeply than whether we're doing a ballet or an opera or if I'm sitting for a portrait for somebody, which is a kind of collaboration too, a strangely passive one, but there it is. Saul LeWitt and I, you mentioned his sculpture, we did a work with Lucinda Childs, this is a classic collaborative process. Saul began, I began writing music for her, and as soon as she began dancing to the music, so the music did come first. She began to sing the music, and Saul began filming the rehearsals. Then he took the film of the rehearsals and made it into another film, and that was projected behind her when she danced. And it was so he layered. It was a layering of the piece, so that it was a kind of a collage, but not of different elements, but a collage of time.
Well, what about the original inspiration? Now, I've heard both you and Shalom refer to, you met each other at a party and you realized that you had this, this obsession with Akhnaten. But surely this idea had been percolating in your head for some time.
No, it took me, no, not really. I was stuck in a way. I had finished Einstein and Satyagraha, so I had Einstein and Gandhi. I was looking for a third subject, and I don't remember how I came across that book by Velikovsky, the Akhnaten and Oedipus, and then the book. These were the two books I started with, and I don't remember where I got them. I think I knew Velikovsky already, but Shalom also knew him, and he happened to be have the expertise in the very subject that I needed an expert informant, an expert collaborator.
And there he was.
He wasn't just there. He happened to be married to a good friend of the woman I was married to, so he was actually part of my world in a way, and then we had become friends, and then we suddenly had an opportunity to do something together.
Well, what about the Kepler project, since that one's more recent? What did that start with, a germ of an idea for you?
It started with a series of pieces that had to do with scientists. Einstein was one. There was one about Galileo. There was I did a film company music for a film, Stephen Hawking. So I had become interested in scientists, but that goes back to a long time. Again, it comes from my early formative years. I was very interested in science as a teenager, and it's when I think about it, many of the things I spent my life working on were things that I encountered in those years before I had the artistic even ambition, let alone the technique. I had no technique to speak of at all as a young. I had to acquire all that. I encountered the subject matter before I knew what I was going to do or even had the way of doing it. That happened later. And then when I was looking for subject matter, it seemed that I had stored all that subject matter almost in my body in a certain way, and there it was. Now so Kepler really was the latest of the scientists. I have a couple more to do that I'd like to do.
Any hints of what those might
what?
be? Any hints for us about
Well,
what those might be?
I'd like to do Newton the Alchemist. I'd be very interested in doing that. And now that I've said it out loud, I'll probably be stuck with the idea. but we'll see. So it happened that the conductor, one of the original conductors of Akhnaten, Dennis Russell Davies, is living in Linz, Austria. Linz, Austria is where it happened that Kepler taught mathematics when he was teaching in the 16th century. I mean, it's quite.
Right.
And he was a little bit before Galileo, and he was worrying about the movement of the planets and stuff of this kind. He was a very interesting guy. He was a very nasty man. He had an enemies list of everyone in his high school. I mean, this is a guy who didn't have very many friends and didn't like people very much. But it's the classic example of the guy with his head in the clouds and his feet in the mud. He was in the mud up to his chin. But he was a dreamer. And the dreamers of the world have always enticed me.
Yeah, that seems to be the theme.
The theme
running
is the
through.
dreamer.
Yeah, right, the dreamer.
Einstein was a dreamer. When he starts talking about relativity, and said, well, how did you get the idea? He once described it this way. It was the most astonishing description. He said, well, I imagined if I was sitting on a beam of light that was traveling through the universe, what would I see? And and he said, then I tried to figure out the mathematics to describe what I saw. And that was the theory of relativity. He saw things brushing past him, and he was sitting still.
Well, he's famous for a quotation about the imagination being more important to him than the facts, and that dream-like
Well,
quality.
I was subscribed to that, and I think Shalom Goldman was subscribed to it too. with Akhnaten, we had to scrounge around for facts. I had all the help I could get. He had a wonderful mentor at Columbia. What was his first name? Cyrus Gordon. And he was much older than us, but he had been in the business for a long time. And the thing about the archaeology business is that you don't get a lot of stuff, and you have to make a story out of it, and it takes a lot of ingenuity, and then the story changes because you find more stuff. But there's truly an act of imagination, and what we did with Akhnaten, and it was something that we had talked about, that we really wanted it. We didn't want to complete the story very much. We left it. I think Shalom called it singing archaeology. That was his. But
It's a great term.
But I would go to these museums with or without him, and you'd see a bit here and a bit there, and from these pieces. And I said, well, maybe the opera should be the kind of residue that the world somehow has allowed to remain. And from that residue, from those relics, from those artifacts, we don't really make the story. If you look at the opera, I was looking at it last night, I was impressed with how truly fragmentary it really is. And yet, if you look at it, it's the death of the father, I was about to say the inauguration, but the coronation of Akhnaten, the Nefertiti, his wife, the children, the fall of Akhnaten, the funeral. Then he joins us his father's funeral. So in a way, it's actually has the virtue of being chronologically correct. But the big of the 17 years. That's all we know about. We don't even know very much about those 70 years. So I just picked the little clumps of things that we had. And I wanted it to be, and I think we agreed about that, I wanted the experience of I wanted the experience of the opera to be somehow to borrow a little bit of the experience of going through a museum and being in front of an exhibit. Then you go to the next part, and then you see the next part. And you walk away and say, I just saw this wonderful exhibit about Akhnaten. But you know enough to tell yourself a story.
Well, the human capacity to create a narrative out of different points and
Our
connect those points.
Our lives, for example.
Right, absolutely. And so the collaboration, in interesting and odd ways, is with the historical figure and then with whatever information the world has provided to us about that historical figure, then with other artists that you are involved with. And also something you mentioned yesterday, it seems to me, consistent with that and what we were just talking about, the role of the audience in a way as a collaborator. You mentioned
Yes.
just now, kind of the fragmentary aspect of what you've created, and then so how does the audience play into this?
This is the classic example of the work is completed by the audience.
Right.
This is the ideas that were fermented by. It comes really out of the art world in a way. It comes from Surrealism and the Dadaist movement and Duchamp and then through him John Cage, and where when Cage did 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, and basically he turned off and you were supposed to listen, and whatever you heard was the music. That's an extreme example, but it's a famous one. And it has the virtue of presenting the idea in a very radical form. You don't have to do it that way, but no one did it in a more radical way than John Cage did. But what we're talking about is the active side of the spectator. Right. That the work, in fact, and this is if we take it a step further, what's really radical about it is that it denies that the work has an independent existence. It doesn't. If we're not listening to Akhnaten, does it exist? Well, may be in your memories, but if no one had ever heard it, would it exist? Or in what way does art exist independently of the human continuum that we're part of?
And our perception of it.
Through perception. And indeed, I would say this is probably the biggest idea of the early 20th century art, was that the string quartets of Beethoven don't really exist. They exist when we play them, we listen to them. But they have no independent existence. And that, for Buddhist-minded people, if any of you are here, you know what I'm talking about. You know, that independent existence is a denial of reality, in a way. Because life is supposed to be changing all the time. If it changes all the time, then it doesn't have an independent existence. It's depending on something else all the time. And that's kind of what we're talking about right now. Well, so that what we're doing is we're taking a perspective on art which affirms something which we were kind of culturally in denial of for a long, long, long time.
There's another side of that same coin, however, and that is that you might take a sonata and in a way it has a life that's longer and deeper and fuller than what we frequently associate with being permanent or structures or part of our daily lives. That it has an existence that's
I don't know
independent of us or of our time.
Rosemary, I have deep questions about that. In other words, does our work outlive us in some way? That's a tricky question. I'm not even sure that it's an important question. I know that many of us depend on it in a way. I was talking to a friend of mine, a sculptor, Richard Serra, was a famous sculptor.
And you've worked with him
I worked
too,
with him all
right.
the time. And we used to work I was his assistant for years, and we used to work with lead, and that used to fall apart. And then he got work with steel, but that would fall apart. And then one day he said to me, no, there's a new kind of steel, a Corten steel. He said, and the pieces I make now will last for 500 years. I said, well, that's great, Richard, but what happens in the year 501? Talking about Egypt, I mean, the astonishing thing is that you go to Egypt today, and the country seems crammed with artifacts from a time that it's 3, 4, 5,000 years before, So, and yet, I don't know whether when we talk about independence. See, I think when you talk about things lasting beyond your time, you're getting nailed back into independence. I'm not sure about that. And yet, I must say I don't worry about it very much.
Well, let's talk about the nature of time while we're on the subject.
Why not?
Yeah. So,
Let's do that too.
Yeah. Cross that off the list. Your work is frequently referred to, and maybe you've referred to it yourself this way, as relying on repetitive structures. Mm-hmm. And as I've listened to your work in preparation for this time that you would be with us and at the opera the other night, and it seems to me, this is just an idea I've had, that that very concept of these repetitive structures is saying something about the nature of time. And I wonder if that could...
Well, I think that is a secondary result of a more primary discussion. But I think it's there.
Right.
I think the first thing that it is about subject matter. Now, if we look at artworks in which we have repetitive structures, usually what happens is that the image is removed. Now that happens in Islamic art for a very good reason. There was a prohibition on having the image of a human. So that if you go and look at the Alhambra and if you go to Spain and look at the Alhambra, you look at the architecture is about repetitive structures. Saul Lewitt does that too. But Saul Lewitt was he a closeted Islamicist? I don't think so. I think he was worrying about the same thing. He was worrying, and not only him, but myself and other people. And I would say that would go for Samuel Beckett and many people that were considered progenitors of a modernist movement. One of the big issues that comes up about the same time that Cage is talking about and Duchamp is talking about completing the work through, that the act of perception is completes the work. At the same time, there are other people worrying about the narrative as content. And we went through a very big period in art where we were working with abstract painting, and whether it was Paul Klee or whether it was Jackson Pollock or whoever it might be, or Frank Stella for that matter, where I took three very different kinds of non-objective work. The essential point was to remove the narrative. Now that also happened in music. It happened in music when the role of narrative would be the role of a theme. For example, though there are themes in Akhnaten, there's a part of that too. It has to do with form and content. One way of there were a lot of ways of doing this, and many of us did it many different ways. Beckett did it by cutting up things, as did Bryson Guyan, so as did John Cage, cutting up and putting them back together and making something that was clearly not narrative. There are many. Sometimes the repetitive structure you could do it. A chance procedure process could do it. You could do it in very formal ways, the way I've done it with my music. But what we were trying to do was to. Now the reason I said this has to do with time. When you put the human being in the piece, you've already postulated a structure of time. It has to do with the life of a person. So in a way, there's another angle of this too, which has to do with form and content. Rosemary, you're bringing up all these things that we'll never get to the end of tonight.
Oh yeah, we're going to wrap it up.
Form and content is a very, very big topic. One of the things about repetitive structures, in that kind of work, form and content become identical. So we don't have to talk about the image because the image is the structure. And that was true for Saul's work, but that would have been true for Beckett's work, and it would have been true for any non-figurative work in general. So that there were a number of strategies for dethroning the narrative, for dethroning the subject. One was through a radical rearrangement of the parts. One was through the repetition of structure. One was through conflating content and form. I'm just mentioning three, but there were many more than that. As many people that got involved with this problem would solve it in their own way. Found objects. Duchamp was another way of doing it, taking the urinal, turning it upside down. I mean,
and yet we tend to tell a story about that.
We don't have to. We do it because we have bad habits. We all have bad habits, but we don't need to have. We don't have to indulge our habits.
Well, let's talk about indulging your habit for just a second.
I indulge mine all the time, so I don't know why.
So tell us about your process of you have a concept, you have a subject, and you have a style, or you have an inclination. And how do these come together? I mean, what is your actual process for?
Okay, I'll take it from the question which is the most urgent for me, which, as you said, you have a style. Just use that word. Composers like to say we have a voice. And I've said this many times, and it fails to become less interesting the more I say it. I find it very... Composers, when they're young, want to find a voice. That's the biggest thing, the biggest obsession. When am I going to get a voice? When am I going to get a voice? Well, inevitably they will get the voice. It comes from 28, 29, 30. With the real great ones, that it comes when they're much younger. Mozart, Schubert, they had it when they were born with it. But we find people like that as frequently as we see angels walking the streets of Atlanta. They exist, but you just don't run into them. So that, for most of us, it comes at a certain point. But that isn't the point. The issue is not finding the voice. The issue is how to get rid of the voice. That becomes the very thing that you thought was going to make your career possible becomes the thing that will immediately begin to defeat you. We're talking about creativity. Creativity has to do with spontaneity, change, the other, the new, whatever you want to call it, the thing that we aren't, the thing that is outside of us that we somehow can express or become part of our own mentality.
And that we don't even know yet.
we never know. One of the most surefire strategies, and I'm an expert at this, I've worried about this for 50 years. The surefire strategy to find for innovation is to find somebody whose work you don't understand and to do a piece with them. You will definitely have to make changes in what you do. I bring to my work my background, my history, my training, and if I, say, work with an African choral player like Fode Suso, and we sit down to play music together, his background is music, but the basis of our music is from a different place. Our being able to do a piece of music together, the collaboration that you're talking about, I guess this is what we're talking about today. One of the real benefits of it is that I'm forced to do something different. What my arsenal, the tools in my toolbox aren't built for that project. I have to find a new tool. So now that can happen with whether I'm working with a designer, a poet, a musician, a dancer. If you look at my work, what I've done, I've rarely repeated pieces with people. Though with Bob Wilson I did maybe five operas, but I wrote 25. So I wouldn't say it was the major part of what I did, but it was an important part. But my work with him was spaced over never more frequently than within 6 or 7 years. I would do another piece with him. So when I finished a piece, I would start and I work with a different group. I didn't do what was probably would have been more common, which is I liked working with these people and I'm going to work with them again. I said I like working with these people and I won't work with them again. It turned out to be a more powerful position to work from, because then I was back in the place where I didn't know what to do. It's only when we don't know what to do that we can do anything. If we do know what to do, then we can't do anything.
So you feel that that's where the creative spirit comes
Absolutely.
from?
When we know what we're going to do, then it's hardly any point in doing it, is it? You agree with me, don't you? You know this, yeah.
You've already done it.
Even when you're cooking, you'll try something and you may ruin it, but it doesn't matter. You just don't want to do the same thing again.
So you nurture that creative spirit in the collaborative process?
I don't nurture it. I force myself into an uncomfortable situation.
Right.
And I've been in that place many times
it.
where there's a kind of a freedom and a joy in being so terrified. I don't know, I have a project to do, I have a person to work with, I don't know what to do.
Have you had any spectacular or trivial mistakes or?
I've had profound changes of perception. I can tell you different stories where that happened. I told this story a few days ago, but this is a good one. We're talking about Fode Suso, the African.
Right.
So we were doing a piece about, we were asked to do music, I was asked to do music for a play by Genet called Les Paravents, the Screens. It's about the French colonial government in Algiers. And it was so you have the Europeans and the Africans, and so I was asked to do that, and I thought I would ask an African musician to work with me, because I thought then, well, maybe I didn't know how to do it really, but I thought, well, it's about Europe and Africa, so let me put that in music. So I had known Fode for a while, but we had never done any music together. And he came to New York, and we sat down, and he had his score. I knew what he played, and I had the piano. And the first thing I said, I didn't know where to start. I said, let's tune the instrument. Well, that was a good, smart thing to do. We're going to have to do it anyway. We couldn't really go very far without doing it. So he played the first note, and the first note was like an A. Kind of close to an A, and I said, okay, that's an A. I said, what do you call that note? He said, I call it the first note. And I said, okay, play the next note. And he played the next note. It was a B. And I played the B, and he tuned it to the B that I had. It was not quite the same one, but it was, close enough so that we were. I said, what's the name of that note? He said, that's called the next note. I said, and what about the note after that? And he played the C. And I said, what's the name of that one? He said, the note after that. And then, and now, this is what happened, Rosemary. I had an almost out-of-body experience. It felt like the floor had disappeared beneath my feet, and I was in space. Now, you have to remember, I began studying music when I was 6 or 7 years old. I remember with my flute teacher, my first lesson, I remember this, and at that moment, I remembered that lesson. That moment came back to me vividly. I held the flute like this. He said, "This is a B, play it, blow into it." He said, "That's what it sounds like." And then he pointed to the music paper and said, "That's what it looks like." So in one moment, I had the name of the note, the sound of the note, and the way you wrote the note.
And the image.
And the whole thing. And suddenly, I was confronted with a wonderful musician, a musician who was a master of his own tradition, and the notes had no names. We actually had to stop working. I was almost it was so shocking. It was a completely shocking experience.
So how did you communicate? How did you
Well,
overcome that?
So I decided that, okay, once I said, okay, now what do we do? I said, okay, the only way for us to do it, I can't write the music down. If he's working in a non-notation system, I have to work in the same system. So I didn't write any of that music down. And I would have had my paper and I would have written it down. In fact, when I was working with Ravi Shankar, when we were talking about music and I couldn't follow what he was saying, he said, "Here, hold the pencil." He was making fun of me, of course, but he was right.
You needed the pencil to think.
He said, "When you hold the pencil, you can think better." He was teasing me, but but he was right. But with Fode, I said, "No pencil, no paper." And we did the piece, and I said, "Okay, you start and I will add music to it." First, we finished the tuning. There were 17 notes, and we got through it. And then,
How long did that take?
What?
How long was that?
Oh, a couple hours. We got everything tuned up. And I was back. I was not hyperventilating. Okay, this is the world I'm going to be in for the next 3 weeks. It's a world in which I can't write down music and notes don't have names, and they're just sounds. And I said, okay, we talked about it this way. He would either start and I would add to what he did, or I would start and he would add to what I did, and that's what we did. And at that point, we invited the director to join us. That was Joanna Kalidas. And she would say, okay, I want music in this scene, and she would tell us what was happening in the scene. And then I would look at Fode, and he would look at me, and one of us would start, and the other would begin to play. And that's how we did it.
So improvisation.
Not exactly, because it wasn't really. Because maybe 2 or 3 years later, if we decided to play the pieces at a concert, I would say, "Remember that piece from the screens? How does it go?" And he would say, "Do you mean this one?" He would play it. It wasn't. He remembered it. It was very different. This happened to me very recently with a Tibetan horn player. We were doing a piece of music together, and I asked him to do a piece of music that would be 3 or 4 minutes long that would fit into a piece we were doing. And he did it. He played the piece. And then I said, "Can you do that again?" And he said, "Okay." And he played it, and it was exactly the same. In fact, the time came out the same. And I said, "Dundo, how are you doing that?" He said, "Well, I'm remembering it." But he remembered it perfectly. This is not improvisation. This is a form of perception and awareness, which is very, very precise. Fode knew exactly what he was writing. And then later, in fact, I didn't have it written down. Later I wrote it down because I would forget it. But after the project was done, I would ask him to play the pieces for me, and then if I didn't remember, I would write it down. So I now have a record of it. And we do concerts because actually, if I didn't write it down, I wouldn't remember it.
So what was the thing that was, as you look back on that, you had that experiential impact of something completely new and different than the way that you had thought about the world and your music. But now, in looking back on it, what did you learn from that?
Well, I learned to conceptualize music without names. I know that sounds simple, but you have to remember that's how I learned it. Basically, and then I applied that to other things. What I learned from it, I went back to things I had learned in terms of harmony and counterpoint from very great teachers that I had. A very wonderful teacher named Nadia Boulanger. I studied with her when I was in my mid-20s, and she was in her early 70s. I spent, there was a certain kind of counterpoint and harmony that we did. She basically was it was more like a brain implant. I had to do it so many hours a day that I learned it. I mean, basically, she just made me do it over and over and over and over again. This very simple stuff, not so simple, but so that I finally knew it. And then I spent the next 40 years, like I said before, trying to forget it. I found myself doing voice learning that she had taught me for no damn reason, but just because she taught it to me. And finally, I'm in my 50s and 60s, and wait a second. I studied this 30 years ago. Why am I doing it now? So unlearning becomes that kind of training. Now, on the other hand, that training was essential for me. What she was really teaching me, see, I got it wrong. I thought she was teaching me the rules of harmony and counterpoint. Actually, that wasn't what she was teaching. She was teaching me to conceptualize music. And the way she taught it was by teaching me harmony and counterpoint. The harmony and counterpoint weren't important, but that was the tools by which I could conceptualize music. She succeeded in bringing me to the point where I could imagine music with much more clarity than I had before. But what she forgot to tell me, and maybe she didn't even know it, she also burdened me with a musical language which maybe wasn't so essential.
So we're at a university, and our responsibility to our students is to be teachers. So 2 questions about that. One is, do you believe that creativity can be taught?
No. However, no. However, technique can be taught, and that's not the same thing.
Right. And that's what you learned in that.
What I learned from her was
right.
technique. Technique is anything that moves things. It can be a shovel. It can be your hand. It can be language. It can be music. A technique is how we change the world. That's what the word technical is about. It's about tools. What our teachers give us are essential tools. However, what they don't tell us is that actually we don't need them. But the point is that we need the tools to get to the point where we can express the work. And once that happens, it's time to get rid of the tools. But everybody, from that moment on, you're on your own. Whether you're Saul LeWitt or you're Samuel Beckett or you're John Coltrane, there are these artists that go very, very far in their work. And you realize if you look at their early work and look at the work later, you say, how did they get there? They got there, first of all, that in the case of Beckett, he was the secretary to James Joyce. Right. He was a great student of literature. He knew it top to bottom. Then he learned French and began to write in French. If you look at the later work and look at the early work, there's a huge difference in that work. If you look at the work of Saul LeWitt or anybody's work. So technique is an interesting thing. It's like that child song that you remember. If you get to heaven before I do, send down the ladder and pull me through. Well, it's a little bit like that. You get to heaven, but you pull up the ladder, and then the rest of us are stuck, and then you have to find your own ladder. Right. One of the things that Boulanger taught me was that, and I said this to a student recently. He said, I don't know what to do with my music. And I said, I know that feeling. It's like walking into a room. It's a restaurant full of tables, and all the seats are taken. He said, right. He said, and you don't know what to do. He said, where's your place at the table? He said, right. I said, actually, what you need to do is build another table. And he got that. I said, oh, I said, just build your own table. Then you'll have room. But that kind of thing, these are, see, the thing about creativity, it's absolutely real. But how we get to it is a torturous affair. If we don't have the technique, we can't get it at all. If you don't have the technique, then you can't even write the language. You can't even write the poems. You have no way to do it.
But if all you have is the technique, you may never get there.
Almost no one is really like that. We pretend that people are like that. They're too technical. No one's really like that. We're human beings. We have hearts and we have feelings and we have memories and we have our own confusion. All of those things work in our favor.
Confusion being an important aspect of creativity.
The technique, we have plenty of the humanness in us. I think the idea that people are technicians is a false idea. However, we can become slaves to a technique too. being free of it. All these are questions that any artist will have to deal with in the course of their life. Or how far, how close, how much do they take with them, how far can they change, or what responsibility to have to their own language, which is actually probably not very much. But we can get bogged down in being who we are.
Well, I have one more question for you about the nature of time, and that is, do you have just 24 hours in your day?
Well, time, it's interesting you should say that. We were talking, there are these mind life sciences that are being studied, and some of it's here in Emory.
Absolutely.
And what we're discovering, or what we're being told by the scientists, is that the brain is very plastic. It can change. And that's exactly how I think about time. We think of time as being finite or being, but actually time you can pull it. It stretches.
Elastic.
It's very elastic. It's shorter or longer. Everybody knows that. You're at the dentist and it's very long. You're having an exquisite moment with a friend and it's very, very short. I mean, we all know that. That's time. That's time for you. And yet, in the same way, we're allowed to measure time. But is the measurement factual in any way? Well, I doubt it. I mean, does the measurement of time have anything to do with time? Maybe not. The experience of time is more important than the measurement. Yet, a consensual sense of time is essential, or we all can't be together here at 4 o'clock, and we can't stop at the time we're supposed to stop, and we're supposed to stop.
Yeah, we're supposed to stop.
Okay,
Yeah.
but so
Very good.
it's the consensual time that we have to agree to, but it doesn't have to be the time that we live in, apart from the allowing us to live together in some decent way.
Something I think you've referred to as extended time as well.
Well, that's what people like Wilson and myself, for that matter, were, and other traditions of theater can take place over 6, 8, 10, 12 hours.
Well, we're not supposed to do that today because other people have things to do and places to go, but you've agreed to take us to a different moment in time, and by ending this program with playing a piece for us and telling us a bit about that collaboration.
This is a very special piece. I wrote a piece of music with Allen Ginsberg in mind. Allen and I took a poem of his called Wichita Vortex Sutra, and I wrote a piece, and we performed it together. It was, the occasion isn't so important, but we were writing as a part of an event that was a fundraising event, and then later it became the basis of an opera we did. So basically, what I had to do, in fact, this is a curious thing about time. This is a wonderful thing. The poem was written in the early 70s during the Vietnam War, and it's about Vietnam. I wrote the music maybe in 97 or 90. I wrote it quite a while later, maybe 20 years later. And at the same time, I was both, and Alan was the narrator. And so when he was, and we traveled around, we did this for about, over a period of 10 years, we did it quite a lot. And other pieces that we did together. And then he died, and he had made this recording for me, so that, because sometimes when I was performing the opera that we'd done together, and he couldn't be there, I was allowed to play the tape. Well, after he died, I didn't play the piece for a long time. It was a profound loss for me. He was a very close friend, and we had done a lot of work together. And it was too painful to think about, to hear the poem. It was just, and about 7, 8 years passed, and then one day I was doing a concert in a situation like this, and I said, I've got this tape of Alan's, let's play it. Let me see what it sounds like. And I played the tape of Alan, and I began to play the piece. And it was as if he was, it was like we were chatting. It was such a great experience. And I've done it a number of times. I do it now without any, I have no prohibitions of myself of doing it. I'm happy to do it. And the wonderful thing about time is that he recorded this for me in probably the early 90s. And I'm playing it live, but in a way he's playing it live too. That somehow the live music lends the liveness of it to the recorded music, and it's very easy to see it in that way. So this is a piece, it's not long, it's about 7 minutes long. It begins with my playing the piano. Let me just tell you, it's a poem about Alan who's traveling across the country. It's probably 1973. He's in Wichita. It's the geographical center of the country. Maybe you thought it was Atlanta, but you're wrong. It's Wichita. And he's driving along, and he starts thinking about the war. And he gets more and more excited about it, and he calls to witness the teachers and inspirations of his life. And he mentioned that he says he wants to call them to be his witness, and in their presence, he declares the end of the war. From that great moment, he suddenly realizes that nothing really has changed. And he's back in Kansas, and that's kind of the curve of the piece. And when I wrote the piece, I thought I knew he had been in Kansas, so I wanted it to be about. I said, what would it be? Well, I've been in Kansas a lot. There's nothing much there. Maybe there'll be a house or a church or something. And so the piece begins without him speaking. It begins with the music that you might hear there. And then it's time, so at a certain point he begins speaking, and then we continue together to the end.
Well, thank you for sharing.
Are you ready?
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.